be able to go live in 1 minute, but I will let you know. It takes a bit of time, sorry. We have the warning. Okay, I think we should be live just now, and we can start a little 3 minutes late. I will copy the streaming link to everyone in the chat so that everyone can share. Feel free to share with your friends so that they can also join, because this is the summer school is designed to be a closed event only for our participants who took part and who also are eligible to join the summer school. So welcome, hoş geldiniz. This is an official welcoming on my side. I'm representing a huge team, an organization team. My friends, I would like to state them out. Betül, Erkan, Enes, Murat, Murat, Zengel also. Veli, Cansu, Ezgi. Sorry if I miss one, guys, please warn me. But I'm just the representative of this huge team who are working for 2 months to make this event possible. And a huge thanks to our professors who also accepted our invitation. They took some part from their summer holidays, from their work conferences, etc., and join in to this conference. So a big welcome to them all as well. And a huge thanks to Didem Buhari and Seçkin Barış Gülmez hocalarımız, who also encouraged us to do this event for 2 months, for 3 months. And the idea stage was almost like a 6-month stage. So we have been developing this idea for a long time, and finally it became a reality. So without taking much time, I will introduce myself. My name is Ahmet Ermihan. I'm from Kadir Has University, PhD, International Relations. And we are really honored to have a very special guest today, Professor Erik Jørgensen, who is an extremely brilliant scholar in our field. And we are really delighted to have him open our summer school. And we are really lucky to do so. Professor Jørgensen has worked extensively on European studies, IR theories, methodology, foreign policy, EU foreign policy as well. So we are really lucky to have him today, and we will listen the talk on what is international relations based on his new amazing book. I will state the house rules that I stated in the mail later on, maybe before Nuri Hoca begins in the next class. So I will not take much time. And Professor Jørgensen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Erman, and good morning to the organizing team and to the participants, not the least. Yes, I will talk about what is international relations. I guess one of the most basic questions it's possible to imagine in our discipline. And I don't know exactly how much time I will take, but in the next hour, we will learn. I will, let's see. I will tell you, as Erman already did, that you can find the answer in my book. It is less than 200 pages, so it's possible to read even during a weekend. You can also have the answer in just one sentence. And this sentence is one of my American colleagues, Don Pucciala, who some 20 years ago wrote that the discipline of international relations is fully fledged, full-blown, autonomous, intellectually legitimate, and accomplished. So that's the short answer. And I think his answer is a correct answer. Then I'll sort of extend that brief answer a little bit. I will probably take some 25 minutes, maybe 35, because that is also the title of my talk today. And given that it is about the discipline, I need to take you more than 100 years back in time to sort of the symbolic beginning of the discipline. And I have to emphasize here, it is a very symbolic beginning. And I know it's a long time ago, but if you want to know really what is the discipline of international relations, then it's very useful, in my view, to know a little bit about how it all got started and how it developed over time in order to understand where the discipline is today. So for that reason, and I know, again, it's a long time ago, and it is for that reason that I have even two images here, both the Majestic Hotel in Paris, but also a beer bottle from what is now Altenjak. At that time, it was called La Punta. About the hotel, it was used, that hotel, as the base for a lot of advisors to those people who were discussing how to frame the Versailles or the Paris peace treaty after the First World War. And some of those days, the advisors didn't have much to do. And for example, on May 30th in 1919, they really didn't have sort of official duties. So they had a meeting in this Majestic Hotel. And someone sort of got the idea that it would be very beneficial if people, citizens in various states, knew more about international relations. It would also be better if there was some teaching of the topic, because at the time there was no such thing. There was no research, there was no teaching, there was no discipline. And basically, this is at least one of the starting points, that meeting on May 30th, 1919. Because soon after, those people, they turned their vision into some concrete projects. For example, soon after, what is now known as Chatham House in London popped up. It didn't exist before. After the 1919 meeting, people took the initiative to create such an institution that could create, it's not public philosophy because it's not run by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It is an independent think tank. And now you find those independent think tanks all over the world. And that big project, that vision started somewhere, and that somewhere is the Majestic Hotel. Now, I should also say that the Majestic Hotel, because of its symbolic significance, is a little bit of an interesting hotel to follow. Because as it happened, when the German occupation forces occupied Paris, they took over the Majestic Hotel and they stole all sorts of documents that had been prepared about how we could possibly launch a discipline of international relations, or the scientific study of international relations, as it was also called. So both was the building occupied by the Nazis, but also the documents were stolen. So there are some archival sources of the origin of the discipline that we could not access because they were not sort of retrievable after the occupation of Paris in 1945. Now, there was a crucial swing of affairs because after the Germans had left the Majestic Hotel, it was taken over by what later became UNESCO, that UN scientific organization for science and education. And as it happens, the UNESCO has, ever since it was launched back in the 1940s, rejected to officially recognize the discipline of international relations. It doesn't exist officially. So there are many different reasons why it is worthwhile paying some attention to the Majestic Hotel. It still exists. And if you have a big wallet, you can sort of accommodate yourself there. But it does take a big wallet because now it's a 5-star deluxe hotel. But maybe at least, I haven't tried, but maybe it's possible to sneak in and at least have a cup of coffee and then think back about sort of the different phases and importances that this hotel has played. The beer bottle on the right side of the image is just to say that things were very different in different places of the world. And I'm quite sure that you cannot find beer bottles from this brasserie de la Punta any longer. The Prokop brewery doesn't exist any longer. It seems that one of the buildings where it took place does. But that's another story. I have to go forward fast. So in order to understand the current state of affairs and the nature of the discipline, I propose that 7 concepts are of tremendous importance. And I plan to start at 12 o'clock with the subject matter. Then I move around the clock to human science, to discipline, to theory, to diversity, to community, and end up with global. It all feeds into what is at the center of our attention, namely international relations and the nature of that discipline. So that's basically the structure of my talk. It is also the structure of my book, so I'm on a kind of familiar territory here. What is the subject matter? And again, the image here is not to show you a stadium that doesn't exist any longer. The image is intended to ask the question or to trigger your imagination and say, okay, what is the subject matter of international relations? Should it really be that difficult to define what is inside the pitch and what is outside the pitch? What is international relations? What are the topics, the themes, and what is outside? What is left to other disciplines? So that's the reason I have this beautiful image of a historical site in Karsheka. Actually, it's outside my windows as well, so I can see it on a daily basis. But back to the subject and the subject matter. I believe that the question is totally wrong. And I have been looking at reading a lot of different articles and books about what is the subject matter of international relations, the discipline. There has been endless discussions and debates for the last 70 years. And there's still no agreement, there's no consensus. Some wants to define international relations in a very narrow fashion. International relations is about war and peace, full stop. And then there are all the protests, no. International relations is about so much more. Actually, it's not at all about peace and war. It is about anything else. So it seems to me that if you want to engage in this discussion, you will be wasting your time. And I will not, of course, encourage you to waste your time. I encourage you to do something that is more useful and more fruitful. And instead of asking the question, what is the subject matter of international relations, you should ask, and other people should ask as well, what are the questions that we scholars in the discipline ask about the world? And given that the world is changing, world politics is changing, the questions as well needs to change. They change over time. What was the key questions in 1919 is not the questions this year, 2022. And if you ask about what are the questions, then you will also see that the development of the discipline around the world has been very different in different places. For example, I'll give you an example of Japanese IR scholars. What did they spend their time on in the 1950s? They asked a very basic question, and it makes sense when you learn what when they sort of addressed the issue that they addressed. They tried to find out how Japan got into the mess it got into in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, because it was a national disaster. And it is an obvious question for people, scholars living in such a country, how that country got itself into the disaster it got itself into. Other scholars elsewhere in the world ask, what are the causes of war and the conditions for peace? That's the classic that you meet in all textbooks. It's sort of a generic question, and maybe it's applicable throughout the world, no matter sort of depending on geography or anything else, because there are wars, there are peace, and what is it that trigger war? What is it that are the conditions for peace? It is sort of a perpetual relevant question. And for that reason, it is among the classic questions. With the current war in Ukraine, of course, it is as topical as you can, it's wrong to say wish for, but you know what I mean. Still other places, some ask, how can the 100 years of humiliation come to an end? It's a typical question if you ask Chinese IR scholars, at least some of them, because in their perspective, China has been in a state of affairs that has been humiliating for 100 years. And now let's try to get out of that state of affairs by defining China differently, by being more autonomous, by doing sort of what China represents in their self-image. Of course, you can continue and so go around the world. I have no time for that, but you can ask yourself, what is the typical questions that IR scholars in Turkey has asked at different times? I think that would be a very worthwhile project to ask. When was there someone who asked a question about international relations in the first place? When was the discipline founded in this country? And how did it evolve? How did it develop? And where are we today? And for the participants in the summer school, where do you think that this discipline should be going? What should be the key questions in the years to come? A very relevant question. And once you have finalized your education, you might want to become an IR scholar yourself. And then it's a very sort of highly relevant question. How you want to grapple with the discipline, how you want to take on the torch and continue the discipline, because then it's your task to reproduce the discipline or change it if that is what you want to do. So it's sort of a very dynamic thing. What is international relations? The answers are different in different places. They are different at different times. And it's only if you know something, at least, about how it developed over time, that you on sort of an informed platform can suggest that I think we should go in this direction because so on, so on, so. So I think that is what I want to say about the subject matter. Forget the subject matter because it's a dead end. It's a blind alley. Ask what are the questions that those people who believe that they belong to the discipline, what kind of questions do they address? Second concept that I want to focus on is what I call the human sciences. And the image here is a tree. As you know, a tree has roots. Then there is a trunk, that is where it appears above the ground, and then it has branches and leaves. I think that's a very telling, informative image of the discipline, because it does have different roots. It did come from somewhere. And among the somewheres, you find the discipline of law. Remember, for example, that classical realism Morgenthau was raised, educated as a lawyer. And it was only when he realized that there were some limits to law that he began to think about international relations and international politics. There are also some of the roots that are within the discipline of economics, because international political economy has been on the agenda ever since the discipline was founded. And who can forget about the discipline of history? It was very, very important and still is in terms of providing insights to what became the discipline of international relations, the trunk of the tree. Now, as you also know, or at least as you know, once the summer school has come to a conclusion, is that the discipline branches out into different theoretical orientations. And I can see on the program that you have some very, very good eminent scholars to introduce you to the different branches of the discipline, the different theoretical branches. And as you know from a tree, the branches and the leaves, that is what makes the tree alive, including the roots. And it's the same for the discipline. Without the roots and without the branches and the leaves, the tree is no longer alive. So also about the question whether the discipline is a social science or a human science. Well, first of all, and here I leave the image. When I look at the discipline historically, I cannot come to any other conclusion than the one that IR has always been on the hedge or been spanning both the social sciences and the humanities. And I just mentioned some examples, some of the roots, history, anthropology, law, economics, and so on and so forth. So it's very, very reducing to say that IR is a social science. It has never been, because history was really a very important source of inspiration, of insights about international politics. And there are other disciplines within the humanities that have also played a very important role. So that's the reason I call the combined space social science plus humanities for the human sciences. But then, if you read articles, still it is the case that people sort of have this image that IR is a social science. And you can find many references to such an image. You can also find many references to the idea that IR, international relations, is a subdiscipline of political science, or subdiscipline of law, or a subdiscipline of economics, or something else. Both these self-images or images are, in my view, misleading. And that's why I believe that the image of the tree is much more fruitful in order to think about the discipline of international relations, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, as an autonomous discipline that exists in its own right. It's not a sub of something else. Actually, as I'll come to in a few minutes, I'll argue that IR has its own subdisciplines. Of course, this image of the human sciences is a little bit of a demanding image, because as you might well know, that the methodologies that are predominant within the social sciences, economics or political science, are sometimes very different from what you find in the humanities. So it is a conception in the human sciences that are really asking you to trigger your sense of flexibility and your acceptance of pluralism, that there's not only one correct method that is sort of the one and the only one. There is a whole range of different methodologies that you can make use of when you do research, when you do your home essays, and so on and so forth. And it's amazing to follow current developments where anthropological and ethnographical approaches are really sort of very fashionable, and they trigger, they produce very interesting results. To do field research in the style of an anthropologist is being used by quite a few IR scholars. And of course, it requires that you actually show some interest in the actors out there, how they conceive of the world, how they conceive of the situation in which they're situated, what they think. all those things that you don't care about, if you, for example, apply rational choice, then it's all assumed. And you are sort of the master of what you assume. And then you let sort of the procedures run their own logics. That's also very useful. I'm not saying that you should do one or the other. I'm just saying here that it would be very beneficial for the discipline if we finally accept that it's a pluralistic and flexible discipline that can do quite a few things. And those few things are all about the questions we ask about the world. So, a plea for pluralism. Discipline, hot or not? Well, as you already now know, I argue that the discipline is a scientific discipline. It is not a sub-discipline of something else. And I don't want to repeat Puchala here, even if it's such a beautiful sentence in my view. So what I want to say instead is that, yes, there is a very lively discussion, conversation ongoing, whether IR is a discipline or not, if it is hot or not. The fun fact about that, all those conversations is that very few people care about what is actually a scientific discipline. They have all sorts of opinions about whether it should be a discipline or not, but they don't care about what a scientific discipline is. So in the book, I do a relatively long detour into that question and ask, okay, what is a discipline? And that's where I find the German scholar Stichwey very useful, because he has made it sort of the choice of his career to look into the development of scientific disciplines and explore the nature and how the nature of disciplines change over time. As he points out in some of his many articles on this topic, the idea of a scientific discipline is actually a relatively, in historical terms, a relatively new idea. It came into being mainly in the 19th century. And if you in this context remember that the symbolic mythological starting point of our discipline is 1919, it is simply the case that international relations as a discipline joined a movement to parcel out different disciplines in the sciences. And I guess that movement to parcel out disciplines was done for some purposes. It was beneficial, and there was a growth in knowledge, in scientific knowledge. So it could just not be in just one big pot. It didn't make sense any longer to conceive of that. So then we got an autonomous discipline of economics, of law, of history, of anthropology, and there's a long range of disciplines, as you know. International relations is part of that picture. So that is what was happening in the 19th century, and especially it was accelerating in the late 19th century, just before IR came into being. Now, these years, disciplines are looked at with very negative feelings from a lot of different corners. Many scholars don't like to be disciplined, and I guess students also don't like to be disciplined, to put into narrow boxes where you have to behave scientifically in a certain fashion. Also, the science, what I call science bureaucracies, think here of Yük and TÜBİTAK as typical examples of science bureaucracies in Turkey. They don't like disciplines as well. The new mantra is to believe in inter, trans, or multidisciplinary research, where you pull a lot of different strings. And these science bureaucracies think that us individuals really can master, say, 10 different disciplines and then pull them together in some empirical issue that is high up on the political agenda. Usually, that leads to what I would call sort of barefoot research, where you pretend that you know all about quantum physics when you do research on IR, And if you sort of care to open a book or just a website on quantum physics, you will learn that it takes quite a few time to grasp what is actually hiding behind that title. And if you then at the same time also want to draw on economics and law, okay, I guess your interest in this empirical topic that you care about is sort of put on the back burner, because there is a few stumbling blocks on your road that you have to deal with first. So in other words, I'm a bit of a skeptic about inter-trans and so on. And to those scholars who believe that international relations is an interdisciplinary field, my answer is simply that, conceive of IR as a discipline. And if you want to mingle with all disciplines, fine, but take IR as your starting point, because that's where you're trained. And sort of don't become a little bit like the image of a Erik, where you know that in the middle, there's nothing. So if what is around is interdisciplinary research, and there's no discipline, then there's no center. And then there's a nothing around which you sort of circle. Not a very good image to do rigorous systematic research. Let me proceed to the IR discipline as such, and my claim that as a discipline, IR has sub-disciplines. And that is something we should celebrate. We should not sort of deploy it and say, oh, it's introduced too much confusion. It doesn't really make us know exactly what is the topic, the subject matter of IR. Let me show you this image about an overview of the IR sub-disciplines. A lot of very good scholars have an interest in international organization. They do fine work, and they conceive themselves often to be IR scholars. So let's say something about the relationship between the discipline and the sub-discipline of international organization. These days, people don't maybe talk that much about international organization. They talk about global governance. And they debate whether global governance is on the rise or not. They discuss what global governance is, if it is good or bad, and so on and so forth. But they care about something that is characterized by a number of highly topical and highly relevant questions. That is, what is a subdiscipline? And they connect to what happens within the wider discipline of international relations. So for that reason, there's a linkage between the discipline and its subdiscipline. Now, I don't think I have time to go through all these subdisciplines, but of course I will send you the slides to Herman and the organizing team after my talk. Then you can check up on what I had in mind when it comes to this dozen and more of subdisciplines that you find within the umbrella term of international relations as an autonomous, fully fledged, intellectually legitimate discipline. And you can sort of box yourself if you want to. Let me proceed to another difficult topic, what is theory? And as I can see from the summer school program, in just 1 month's time, all participants will know much better what is theory. So I will not go through all the different theoretical orientations that you find inside the discipline of international relations. Actually, I wrote a textbook about that topic as well, which I can highly recommend for that purpose if you want to see sort of the big branches of the tree that I showed you before. So instead, I will focus on something that is much more delineated, much more narrow, namely what is the function for the discipline, the function of theory for the discipline. Because it is not the case that theory has always been sort of what I define or what I see as the spine of the discipline. For the first 20, 30, 40 years, it varies across different places around the world, but there was no theory. IR was an emerging discipline, and it was only, it seems to me, during the 1950s that some people got the idea that we need to upgrade our theoretical awareness. We need to begin to theorize. And they had some ideas about what that meant. And the problem was that they sensed that some very powerful people in different positions did not share their idea about IR being a scientific discipline. Maybe they would say, what's the difference between IR and journalism? What is the difference between IR and speculation, or any other sort of negative term that you could find? So those people in the 50s, they got this idea that we upgrade our discipline by actually defining some of its constituting theories. Thereby, we will legitimate IR as a scientific discipline. And they did so very successfully, because increasingly IR was recognized as a scientific discipline. More and more departments, in some countries more fast than others, IR popped up, IR chairs were established. I think the big takeoff in Turkey was also in the 1950s, when both universities in Ankara and Istanbul got the idea that we need a department of international relations. But I don't know the nitty-gritty details about the emergence, the development of IR in Turkey. So maybe that is something that you can discuss among yourself and then inform me. But in this context, for sure, I want to emphasize that it is only in certain parts of the world that theory is considered to be of value. You can interview the first 100 IR people in, say, India, and the majority would tell you that theory, we don't have time for that. It doesn't advance my career if I define myself as a theorist. I should provide practical knowledge about practical problems in the real world, and that's what the game is about here. If I master these real problems in the real world, then I might have some chances of progressing, of advancing with my career. But theory, no thanks, I'm Indian. And that Indian is not alone. There are similar scholars situated elsewhere in the world, where it's also much more important to be a pretentious guy who appears on your TV screen and say some seemingly wise word about the real world, and dismissing these academics who don't know anything about the real world. I guess you know those guys also here in Turkey. So let me, for that reason, return to our world, the academic world, and look a little bit about how theory has been a moving target during the last 100 years. Remember, this is the time frame of the discipline and also of my talk, even if sometimes I go really speedy through the decades. For example, here I say that since this symbolic evening meeting at the Majestic Hotel and until the 1940s, the Second World War, you can begin to find books published which are called Theories of International Relations. The first one I found was published in 1936. And when I saw the title, I said, gosh, that seems to be interesting. How was the theoretical world of IR in those times? And I have to admit I was slightly disappointed. Okay, the book has 500 pages, so it's not sort of a brief book to go through, but it was all about what different people had of ideas, reflections about thought, about international affairs over time, back to antiquity. So what was the thinking about Homer, our local guy, Homeros, right? what reflection did he have about international relations? Well, he wrote about Troy, and he wrote about Ulysses, and so on. So there was quite some war, at least some peace as well, to think about. And there were different communities, and they were not always on peaceful terms. So he had some reflections about this. Okay, if you have reflections about this at some point in historical time, then you're included in that book published in 1936 about international theories of international relations. If you then jump to the next 3-4 decades, 1940 to 70, much more of the same. You can find several books published on the theme of international relations theory, but it's similar to the one that was published in 1936 by Russell. But then, as I mentioned before, some people began to think that theory should be something else. After all, in respectable disciplines like, say, economics, sociology, there were at that time really high-level theoretical thinking. Did not Max Weber have some very sophisticated ideas about what is theory in both explanatory and interpretive terms? Yeah, that was not unseen. So how could that possibly be imported into the discipline? And that is what people spent some time on in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. Sometimes it turned out to be experiments that failed. For example, there was a big movement which tried to theorize or to develop what they call a general theory of international relations. Pure failure. But at least something came out of it, namely the lesson that was the wrong thing to do. Then 1970s to 1990, what you found was more reproduction, but also this idea that because the movement towards a general theory of international relations failed, there was a gradual recognition of the fact that it has to be a pluralistic understanding. Over here, we have liberal theories. Over here, we have realist theories. Over here, we have political economy, at the time called Marxist theories, and so on and so forth. The tree branches out in a number of theoretical orientations. Sometimes that is called the inter-paradigm debate. It can also be called something else. That's not really what matters here. The key idea I want to sort of submit is that the branching out took place. Then basically what happened since 1990 and until 2013 is that it became a full palette. There was no limit, or so it seemed, to what kind of theoretical orientation you could cultivate if you had a self-image as an IR scholar, as an IR theorist. And it became a very rich environment. And the summer school program reflects exactly that. So again, no need for me to go into nitty-gritty details, even if they are important, as the professors who follow me will point out, and rightly so. Instead, I want to go to the last decade, 2013 and until the present. More of the same, but also, as I write in this box, also distortion and a decay of the theorizing culture. And the symbolic event here is the publication of a special issue of the European Journal of International Relations in 2013, the end of IR theory. For example, Mearsheimer and Ward has a very important article published in that special issue, where they point to an alarming, in their view, alarming tendency in American departments, namely that theory as such is disappearing from the agenda. And instead, people inside the discipline pick what they call hypotheses from the blue sky and then they match these from the blue sky picked hypotheses, and they test them on all these data sets that have sort of popped up in the meantime. And then they come up with some answers. The point here is that there is no feedback to what is sort of accumulated knowledge. And I think that is what you find in the theories. So that is really sort of for the discipline, it is a very unfortunate development. And Mearsheimer and Wald are not alone in sort of observing this. I have been, just the last few days, I've been reviewing a research project that is of the same tendency. No theory, even if there was a section called theory, but underneath there was 2-3 pages on hypotheses. So very alarming. And if you want to contribute to the discipline, then you need to do something about this. You need to begin to theorize yourself, because not so many other people will. Let me go to another hot topic, namely diversity. And here, my simple argument is that even if there are ever more calls for diversity in the discipline is as it is, and it is as diverse as you can wish for. It has a whole range of questions about current and historical affairs. That was the substitute for the subject matter, you remember. It has a wide range of subdisciplines. I listed at least a dozen. It has a wide range of theories. Again, check the summer school program. It has lively debates about the community's norms and standards. I'll come back to that in a minute. It is practiced differently in different parts of the world. In other words, pluralism rules. It's a very diverse world of IR, and it spans both the social sciences and the humanities. So how can you not call a discipline diverse? Actually, you can also find an article that goes through articles, many articles, where people express fear about this growing diversity, because it seems to end nowhere. It's going to be ever more diverse. There's no end to it. Amazing. And still, all the calls for diversity pops up, and they continue to pop up, and they will pop up probably also in the next 5 years. So what is happening here? Well, I think the current calls for diversity mistake the discipline for the community of scholars that is sort of the guardian of the discipline, that are those who cultivate the discipline. And most of these calls for diversity really don't care about the discipline. But what they make a plea for, more or less rightly so, is that there should be more diversity in terms of the community, in terms of gender, race, geography, and at least sometimes class as well. Because yes, the discipline run by the community, the community of people, of IR scholars who cultivate the discipline, is uneven in terms of gender, race, geography, and class. So something has to be done in that direction. But it's very important to keep in mind what I introduced this section all about, namely that it is diverse in many other ways as well. So what is diversity? Well, define diversity, and then we can look for some answers to what is diverse and what is not diverse. I guess that is what I wanted to say about diversity. Community. Well, if you want to understand the discipline and how it emerged, how it developed, how it is today, and how it might develop in the foreseeable future, then you simply have to look into the community of scholars who represent it. I guess that is as logical as it can be. So we need to understand the community of IR scholars in this anthropological fashion. we need to look as an anthropologist would do if she went to some faraway island and began to study the population. What are the norms of these islanders? What are the standards? What are the rules, the rituals, the ceremonies, the mythologies, and so on and so forth? That is what many anthropologists do when they study life forms. And IR is a life form. And if you have not acknowledged that yet, well, then you have something to learn. And in my view, it's a very pleasant and challenging and inspiring, exciting life form. So I'm very happy that I chose this, even if that was not my first choice of a career. So what are the norms, standards, rules, ceremonies, rituals of us IR people, us islanders in the island of IR? Well, it's something that your teachers never tell you. And it's something that my teachers never told me. So you have to do some digging yourself. You have to find out on your own. And maybe a shortcut I suggest is to read the ever more popular genre of essays that is typically entitled "Why I Left Academia." Because those people who left academia, they are sometimes very frank about what they observed. And they give some very, I guess, sometimes very good reasons for why they left. Because they didn't want to stand up to those mythologies, those ceremonies, those rituals. I mean, IR academia is about being unpaid for a lot of years, where you are supposed to work hard. And then maybe, but only maybe, you'll get a job. If that is something that characterizes all islands, I don't know, but the island of IR, well, that is typically the case. And there are ever more rituals and ceremonies and standards that are entering the picture. These years are full of sort of newcomers concerning the rituals, the norms. The norm picture is undergoing change. And if you want to sort of be part of that, or not, or if you want to change it, you have to discuss it. You have to have a serious discussion about the norms of the discipline as it is currently practiced. 2 years ago, there was a now infamous example of the norms of the discipline. My good colleagues Ole Wever and Barry Busan, you know, the theorizers of securitization theory, were charged of racism. The charge was that the theory is racist. And that sort of triggered a long discussion about the norms of the discipline. And I guess you need to read more about this discussion in order to understand where is sort of the edge of the current discussion about the norms of the discipline. I don't have time to go into it, and I just give this example. Then, of course, it's a fact, I believe, that we do need to introduce students not necessarily to the norms of the community, but to the norms of the discipline, which is something different. How do you get published? What do you do and what do you not do? How can you possibly sort of get yourself a career? How is sort of scholarly standards in the discipline when it comes to conversations about topics on which you are clearly in disagreement? So we need to introduce newcomers, that is students, to the disciplinary norms and rules. In other words, we need to discipline the students. There's a better term for that. That is called teaching. And that is what I do right now. That is what you do when you teach students as well. So in this context, maybe to swallow this bitter pill that you need to be disciplined, to give it some sugar, then recall where discipline comes from in etymological terms. It comes from Latin, and it means to learn. Discere, to learn. That is what it is all about. To be disciplined is to learn. Now it feels much more sugary, right? And not so bitter. Anyway, I have one more stop on my journey, and that is what is global. And my argument here is that the discipline is very global. But despite this claim of mine, it is also a fact that you find, I don't know how many, but innumerous examples of articles, even books, where the authors make a plea to globalize the discipline. And I guess it started some 20 plus years ago, when an article, highly cited, was published about IR as a discipline not so international, and not so international discipline. But from that point of time, there have been ever more calls to make it more international, to make it more global. So how come that there is less contradiction between my claim that the discipline is global and all these calls? Well, first of all, it's a fact that theorizing as an activity, as one of the activities of the discipline, is predominantly done in the West, in the United States, and in parts of Europe. Not so much in what is sometimes called the West and the West. That is why Barry Busan and Asheria wrote an article some 15 years ago. Why is there not so much international, what was the title? Why is there no IR theory in the rest of the world? Something like that. It's a very important article. You have to read it in order to understand this problematique. But it is also the case, I would argue, that if you look at the real world in historical terms, then it's a fact that in this 100-year-long time span from 1919 and until the present day, in 1919, there were not that many countries. And in those relatively few countries, there were not that many universities. And in order for a scientific discipline to have a home, you need at least a university. If you need a country, I'm not sure, but at least the Central European University has some experience of sort of being kicked out of a country, namely Hungary, because it was seen by the Hungarian government as sort of a side business of Soros. And in this picture, Soros is the bad guy. So the Central European University still exists, but now has its premises in Austria, in Vienna. So probably also need a country, a geography to have your base. But look at Africa and the development of first the number and then the development of universities. Until the 1960s, 70s, not many African countries had universities. And for that reason, there was no discipline at home for a discipline like international relations. Now there is, but this is a relatively recent development. So what can you expect coming from major parts of the world where universities is a relatively new phenomenon to have? And those universities are not necessarily among the most wealthy. Actually, it's the opposite is the case. So IR is not always sort of the priority number one. Engineering is way more important, like here in Turkey, where you find the engineering departments having always the nicest, the biggest, the newest, the most fabulous buildings. And IR, yes, it does exist at some universities, more and more, but not always in the most prestigious buildings. You get the picture. So you have to take some real world facts into consideration when you look at this uneven development of the discipline. You can also, I think that is my advice, you can look into the ways in which people reach the conclusion that the IR discipline and IR theories are Western phenomena. For example, it's a very common procedure to have this argument, and then in order to provide some evidence, you select what is called the 5 most prestigious journals. And you count 667 articles in those journals. And you come to the conclusion that, most of these articles are written by Western scholars. And I guess that was sort of a predictable conclusion, given that those prestigious journals take quite some infrastructure back home to get into in the first place, even if you are among the most smart guys in this world. Many smart guys don't have the institutional infrastructure, the departments, the research support teams, and so on and so forth, the funding to have what it takes to get into international organization. So I guess the conclusion was given at the starting point of the procedure. Instead, why not do some research on what is done in, say, Western Africa, what is published? They have a dozen of more IR journals. And given that the people in the departments in that part of the world do not publish maybe in what is called the 5 most prestigious journals, they do IR research on topics that they find both interesting and highly relevant. And they are appreciated by sometimes at least universities and the governments. It is also for that reason that, for example, in India, a career as an IR professor is fully compatible with becoming a minister or something else in the political world. Whereas we IR professors in the Western world more and more live in our ivory towers, as is sometimes called, because our knowledge is not that relevant for the problems that those people in political or admin positions find relevant. So if you want to argue whether the discipline is global, well, study what is done globally. For example, I was amazed to find these articles about what Japanese professors spent their time on in the 1950s. And yes, I got the point. It makes a lot of sense for Japanese IR professors during that time to consider the question, how did we get ourselves into this mess? And can that be avoided in the future? I guess many German scholars did something similar at the time, but they are typically overlooked because the Japanese and the German professors tend to publish in Japanese and German. And if it's not published in English, typically in this kind of research that tell you that IR is not a global discipline, German and Japanese is not read. It doesn't exist. And for that reason, it doesn't enter into your statistical analysis. Too bad, but it exists nonetheless. You just have to learn a language if you have an interest in the topic. So for that reason, I have this observation that the globalizers, those guys who make all the calls for globalizing the discipline, and also the opposite, the parochials, they simply neglect what actually exists out there in the world. And for that reason, they reach predictable conclusions. Globalizers, of course, they don't want to pay attention to that because it's a very sort of uncomfortable finding that doesn't fit the rhetoric. And in that sense, I guess the research can, with some right, be called slightly biased. And the parochials, those guys who don't care about whether the discipline is global or not, well, they just do their business. And it might be to look into a sort of nitty-gritty empirical topic that they find very interesting. And the state of affairs in the discipline, and if it's global or not, they couldn't care less. That's why I call them parochials. They are in their own sort of province, intellectual province. And the most interesting question in this context is the last one, I guess. How would a truly global discipline look like? No one who make a plea to globalize the discipline put up sort of the end product. How would it look like? Would the 50,000 Chinese IR scholars would they be defining the discipline? Because they are the majority. Get used to it. But fortunately, they publish mainly in Chinese, so they don't exist, right? The research doesn't exist. So at least pay attention to what's the tailors, what's the end product, if you want to make a plea that it should be more international, more global. Final point, conclusion, what is IR? Well, I will repeat the Donald Pucciala here, because that is what I believe deeply, that is what the discipline is. It is an discipline. It is fully fledged, it's full blown, it's autonomous, intellectually legitimate and accomplished. And in order to get to that conclusion, you have to get yourself on a journey where 7 concepts are kind of milestones. You have to pass them, you have to then proceed. And each of those concepts are among the most difficult concepts we have in the social sciences and the humanities. Community. I know a guy who wrote a book about what is a community, and he didn't even reach a conclusion. It's amazing. And what is discipline, right? Oh, there's a library of books and articles about what is discipline and what is the IR discipline. Same thing with theory. At least concerning theory, you will have some eminent guides in the coming days and weeks to guide you through what is theory and what is IR theory and why is that important. And is it something that you can subscribe to? And if not, then please argue why it is not the case that you subscribe to this theory or that theory or that theory. That is what IR scholarship is all about, is to find solutions to such problems. And finally, the subject matter, forget about it and ask about what are the questions, what are the relevant questions. And if the relevant questions are not currently on the agenda, then put them on the agenda, contribute to the discipline and its development. Soon it's your turn. Thank you very much for listening this morning to my talk.
Thank you very much, Professor Jørgensen. It was absolutely an eye-opening keynote speech. That will be an absolute blast introduction to our summer school. So thank you very much for your talk. We are slightly over time, but I would like to, if you allow, and if you have extra bit of time, I would like to state Simge İçen's question / comment so that we can move on to Nuri Yurdusev's presentation. Apologies to Nuri Hocam as well. We also haven't taken his time as well, but these 5-10 minutes delays will happen. So all of the audience will also be, I think, comfortable with that. Simge states that I think we should definitely focus on the future of the world. Maybe the question is, when is the people see the reality of today's world problems, like climate change? So if you have comments on this, Professor Jørgensen, we can hear it, and then we can conclude the session if you like.
Well, I think this is probably among the most relevant questions that we can ask ourselves these days. And it's a question that does not appear that high up on the agenda of contemporary international relations. It's amazing. It is as global as it gets. What's more global than the global climate? It's one planet, it's one climate. It has different effects in different parts of the world. And us who currently are in the East Mediterranean, well, we better get used and address that question way more than we currently do, because according to all predictions, the East Mediterranean region will be the region in the world where some of the consequences of climate change will be felt most. So we might think, I certainly do, that the last few days with 38 degrees of temperature, as a Dane, I felt that pretty hot, but it will get hotter. And the drought that currently characterizes major parts of Europe will get worse. The Mediterranean Sea will, according to all predictions, will rise. And when I walk down the Karsøy-Stanley waterfront, okay, 1 meter, then a major drive-through will be flooded. And I don't see how people can get from different parts of Izmir to another part, from the north side of the bay to the south side. when that happens. I know that other cities are preparing themselves for flooding. One of the very local, small cities in Denmark that I pass from time to time, I see this barrage down the harbor front. It's not expected that the sea will rise that high, so it's just 1 meter. And there are some gates that can close when there is a flooding alert. Most recently, that is only 4 or 5 months ago, there was a flooding. There was an alert, and it was only by pure stupidity that no one was thinking about closing those gates. So the lower parts of the city became flooded again. So the question about climate change, I guess, should be elevated to the very top, to the short list of questions that we should care about, and we should find answers. And if there are among the contemporary or the current sort of palette of theoretical orientations, if there are no theory that is capable of helping us doing research, empirical research on these matters, then it's high time for someone to begin theorize about this. And of course, in this context, keep in mind that theories never should be seen as providing answers. They provide tentative answers. And it is our job, your job, to test those tentative answers to see if there's any connect to the indicators that you draw on in order to test your theories against real-world evidence. So don't believe, I think at least that is not my take, my approach. I know some other people disagree. They see theories as almost as ideologies that you should believe in, that you should take on as your personal identity. You should join one of the cartels that subscribe to a certain theoretical orientation. And if you are for some years a good apprentice, then you might be elevated up into these sacred circles of the real people who know real things about the real world. But that's, in my view, ideologues. And I find ideology interesting, not to practice, but to study. So my advice is to treat theories as some accumulated knowledge that provides some tentative answers, but they're not final answers. You have to test them on the empirical evidence that you can collect, and then come up with some conclusions on your rigorous theory-informed research. That's the way forward, in my view.
Thank you very much, Professor Jørgensen. This was a great talk, actually. We benefited a lot. I'm sure our students, our colleagues, our viewers from YouTube have also benefited from it. We are slightly over time, so we wouldn't take much of your time, and we will lead the floor to Ahmet Nuri Yurdusev Hocam, and we are directly heading towards the second lecture. And we would like to thank you so much for sparing the time and bearing with us throughout this 2 months of preparation process. Thank you so much for everything.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for having me. It was really a delightful thing, and I'm very pleased that I can report back to my publisher when I meet the editor in 2 weeks' time in Athens, that I've had this talk and I've done some promotion for my dear book. And I hope you clicked, and I hope that you will enjoy your lunch.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And we also end the live stream on YouTube here. Thank you so much for the viewers on YouTube. And we are now turning into our closed session, and we will continue with the